I had never in my life been refused anything, and I mention this not as a boast but as a confession, for a man who has never once heard the word no said plainly to his face is a man who has been very poorly prepared for the day it comes. I learned better at my own wedding, in the county church my great-grandfather had endowed, beneath the memorial tablets of 6 generations of my house, with the bishop of the diocese standing before me in his lawn sleeves and half of fashionable England packed into the pews behind. I learned it from my own bride in 3 words delivered in a voice as cool and unhurried as though she were declining a second cup of tea. I have since had a good many years to reflect upon the lesson, and I own now that I deserved every syllable of it, but I did not think so then. Then I thought only that the world had come loose from its hinges, and that some correction was urgently required, and that I was, as I had always been, the man to make it. Let me begin at a distance from the altar, for the fall is not comprehensible without the height, and I was a man who lived at a considerable height. I was Anthony, 5th Duke of Rexford, and I had been the Duke since the age of 19. When my father contrived to break his neck over a hedge he had been warned against, thereby leaving me a dukedom, 4 estates, a seat in the Lords, the presentation of 11 livings, and the settled conviction, absorbed with my mother's milk and hardened by every year since, that the ordering of the world was among my personal responsibilities, and that I discharged it well. I do not say I was a bad man. I was told often that I was a great one, which is a more dangerous thing to be told, and I believed it with the serene absence of doubt that only the very fortunate and the very stupid can manage, and I flattered myself I was not stupid. I was, by every account including my own, clever, exacting, and just. I paid my people fairly and I ruled them absolutely. My tenants prospered and touched their hats. My stewards trembled and kept excellent accounts. My acquaintances feared my tongue and courted my notice in the same breath, which I found a perfectly reasonable arrangement. In 35 years I had commanded a great many people to do a great many things, and every one of them had done as I commanded, and I had drawn from this the natural inference that the arrangement was permanent and universal, as one draws from 35 consecutive sunrises the inference that the sun is a dependable article. It followed, then, that when I resolved to marry, I approached the business precisely as I approached the drainage of a water meadow or the disposal of a rotten burrow, as a matter to be arranged. I was 35, the succession wanted an heir. The thing was overdue, and I set about it with the brisk distaste of a man clearing a long-postponed item from his desk. I required a wife of good blood, good sense, and good health, one who would grace my table, manage my houses, present me with a son, and otherwise conduct herself as the Duchess of Rexford ought, which is to say, quietly, ornamentally, and in accordance with my wishes. That such a woman would be found, and would be grateful, I never for one instant questioned. I was a duke. Mothers had been laying their daughters across my path like carpets for 15 years. The particular carpet, as it fell out, was Miss Susanna Kerr, and here I must be careful, for it would be easy to tell this part as though I had been managed, and I was not managed, I chose. But the ground upon which I chose had been prepared by others, and the chief of these was her guardian and mine own man of business's associate, Sir Godfrey Milton, a stout genial rogue who held the mortgages upon the late Mr. Kerr's estate and a good deal else besides. Susanna's father had died, leaving more debts than land and a daughter of spirit but no fortune, and Sir Godfrey, to whom the debts were owed, had let it be known in his oily way that an alliance between his ward and the Duke of Rexford would answer everything, would clear the encumbrances, secure the sister, and settle a troublesome young woman who had already refused 2 respectable offers on the impertinent grounds that she did not care for the gentleman attached to them. I recall Sir Godfrey saying that to me, in my own library, with a wink, as though it were a recommendation. She has refused before, your grace, but she'll not refuse you. And I recall answering, without looking up from the papers before me, no, she will not. God forgive me, I meant it as a simple statement of fact, the way one might say that water runs downhill. I had met the lady perhaps 4 times before I offered for her, and I ought to have read those 4 meetings more closely than I read my rent rolls, but a man does not scrutinize what he believes he already owns. The first was at the Aldermartins' ball, where I found her not dancing but standing at the edge of the floor watching the dancers with an expression of such frank and private amusement that I went over, unasked and unintroduced, to discover its cause. I told her I could not think what she found so diverting. She looked at me. She had a way of looking level and grey-eyed and entirely without the flutter I was used to, and she said that she had been trying to decide which of the gentlemen present admired themselves the most, and that I had just settled the question by walking across the room. I was, I confess, more startled than offended. No one had spoken to me in that manner since my tutor, and my tutor had been paid too. The second meeting was at a dinner where I contradicted her upon some point of politics, expecting the usual graceful surrender, and instead found myself half an hour later in retreat. Having discovered that Miss Kerr read the newspapers, I only skimmed and remembered what she read. The third meeting was at a musical evening got up by Lady Aldermarton, where I found her presiding over the tea urn with an air of ironic ceremony, and where, upon my remarking that I did not much care for the soprano then torturing an Italian air, she replied that she had observed as much, since I had been wearing throughout the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head, and that she wondered I had not simply purchased the concert, and had it stopped, as that appeared to be my usual method with anything I disliked. The fourth I shall pass over almost entirely, save to record that we quarrelled with great enjoyment over the management of a charity of which she was patroness and I subscriber, that she carried her point by the simple expedient of being right, and that I rode home in a temper I could not account for and slept very ill. On each occasion I came away with the sensation, novel and not wholly agreeable, of having been in a contest rather than a conversation. On each occasion I told myself I had been merely amused. And on each occasion I resolved to seek her out again and did not once pause to ask myself why a man surrounded by admirers should so persistently pursue the one woman in England who declined to admire him. I told myself this was because she would make a suitable duchess, handsome, well-bred, wanting only fortune which I had in indecent abundance. I told myself it was because a wife with without her would be less tedious across 40 years of breakfasts than the soft pretty nothings who simpered at me from every drawing-room in the kingdom. Both these things were true and neither was the truth. The truth, which I did not admit to myself until long afterward, was that Susanna Kerr did not look at me as a duke, and this both affronted and fascinated me beyond anything I had known, as a locked door will fascinate a man who has never in his life found one that would not open to his hand. I mistook the fascination for approval and the affront for challenge, and I concluded, with the magnificent idiocy of my kind, that I should very much enjoy being married to a woman of spirit, by which I meant, though I would have denied it hotly, a woman of spirit who had been broken to my hand. The spirit preserved as one preserves a spirited horse, for the pleasure of possessing what others could not ride. I offered. I did not precisely propose. I informed. I called upon her in Sir Godfrey's dreadful overgilt saloon, and I told her that I had determined to make her my wife, and that the settlements would be generous beyond anything her situation could command, and that her sister's future would be secured and her father's debts extinguished as a matter of course. I laid it all before her as one lays out an unanswerable case, and I waited not for her consent, which I assumed, but for her thanks, which I felt I had earned. She was quiet for a long moment. She was seated by the window with the grey afternoon light on her face, and I remember that she did not fidget or blush or drop her eyes, but studied me as though I were a document she had been asked to sign and meant to read to the last clause. Then she said, "You have told me a great many things, Your Grace, but you have not asked me anything." I said that I did not perfectly take her meaning. She said, "I do not suppose you do." And then, after a silence in which I understood that Sir Godfrey's mortgages and her sister's portion and the whole crushing machinery of a woman's dependence were being weighed in that quiet room and found, at last, immovable, she said that she would marry me. She said it the way a soldier surrenders a fortress he cannot hold, without a tear and without one particle of the gratitude I had come to collect. I ought to have heard it. A wiser man, or merely a humbler one, would have gone home that night and lain awake and understood that he had purchased a body's consent and not a heart's, and that such purchases are dangerous precisely because the seller keeps something back. But I had only the yes. Yes was the word I had come for, and yes was the word I received, and I rode back to Rexford House well pleased with myself and my afternoon's work, and gave orders for the marriage to be celebrated with every magnificence the county could support. If I thought of her reservations at all, I thought of them as the last small resistance of a stream about to be dammed, audible now, and shortly to be silenced under the smooth deep water of my will. I was accustomed to being obeyed. I did not doubt that I should be obeyed in this, the greatest command I had ever issued, any more than I doubted that Tuesday would follow Monday. That, you understand, was the whole of my error, entire and complete. I believed that she had agreed to obey me, when in truth she had only agreed to marry me, and the distance between those two things was a chasm I could not so much as see. The day came in the last brilliant week of September, one of those high blue autumn mornings that England produces perhaps 6 times in a year, as if in apology for the other 300. The bells of St. Anne's had been ringing since dawn. The road from the village was lined 3 deep with tenants and gawpers and hired postilions, and the churchyard was a garden of feathers and superfine, for I had asked half the peerage, and the half I had not asked had come regardless. Unwilling to miss the spectacle of Rexford brought at last to the altar, the bishop himself had consented to officiate a favour. He was at pains to remind me that he did not extend to every wedding, though he extended it readily enough to dukedoms. I stood at the chancel step in a coat that had cost more than a curate's living, and I looked down the long nave at the great west door, and I remember with perfect clarity, entirely happy. In the flat, complacent way of a man watching a well-drilled regiment march precisely where he has ordered it to march, she came in on Sir Godfrey's arm, and here I will grant myself one honest sentence, unspoiled by hindsight. She was beautiful. She wore a gown the colour of cream and a veil that did not hide her face, and she came up that aisle at a measured, unhurried pace, neither dragging nor hastening, with her chin level and her grey eyes fixed not upon me, I noticed, but upon the great east window beyond me, as though she were walking towards something in the far distance of which I happened to be standing in the way. The whole church had turned to watch her. I remember thinking, with proprietary satisfaction, that she carried herself like a duchess already, and never once suspecting that a woman who walks up an aisle looking past the bridegroom is a woman who is not, in her own mind, arrived at him at all. There was a moment, before the service, that I have since come to regard as the last exit I was offered and refused. As she reached the chancel step and Sir Godfrey delivered her arm into the keeping of the ceremony, she glanced at me for the first time, one brief, level, searching look. The look of a person asking a question that has no words, and I, who might have answered it with a softening of the eyes, a whispered kindness, some small human sign that I understood I was marrying a woman and not annexing a province, gave her instead a nod of grave satisfaction. The nod of a general reviewing troops that have arrived on time. I saw something in her face close like a shutter. I mistook it, of course, for maidenly nervousness composing itself, and thought no more of it, and turned to the bishop well content. The bishop began. I heard the great sonorous phrases roll out over the packed and silent church, dearly beloved, this holy estate honourable among all men, and I stood tall and let them wash past me as one lets pass the preamble to a document one has already resolved to sign. And then we came to the vows, and the bishop turned to her, and asked whether she would take this man to be her wedded husband, and whether she would obey him, and serve him, and love, honour, and keep him. And it was there, in the small deliberate pause before she answered, that some devil of certainty rose up in me and would not be still. I do not fully know, even now, why I spoke. I have turned it over 10,000 times. Perhaps it was the word "obey" ringing out in the bishop's mouth that woke my whole life's assumption and gave it a tongue. Perhaps it was that her face, in that pause, was so composed, so utterly unsurrendered, that some part of me sensed the fortress had not truly fallen and moved to plant my flag upon it before she could speak. Whatever it was, I did a thing no bridegroom in that church had ever seen done. I turned to her before the bishop, before God, before the assembled quality of 3 counties, and I said, quietly, but not so quietly that the front pews did not hear, for I meant to be heard, I said, "Understand me, madam. Whatever else this marriage may be, I expect obedience. Let there be no misunderstanding between us upon that head. I said it as a man states a term of business. I said it, God help me, kindly as I imagined it, as a fair warning honestly given, a clarity for which she should be grateful." The bishop's mouth opened and hung open. A rustle went through the pews like wind through wheat. And Susanna Kerr turned her head and looked at me, full at me now, no longer past me, her grey eyes clear and wide awake and holding, I saw too late, something that was not fear at all but a kind of terrible relief, as of a prisoner who has just been handed the key by the gaoler's own hand. She did not raise her voice. She did not colour. She let a silence fall that was somehow louder than any shout, and into that silence, before the bishop, before the whole packed and breathless church, in a tone as cool and level and unhurried as though I had off her the salt, she said, "I do not." 3 words. Then she turned, not quickly, not in a flurry, but with the slow, deliberate grace of a woman who has all the time in the world and knows exactly where she is going, and she gathered her cream skirts in one hand, and she stepped down from the chancel. And she walked back down the long aisle toward the great west door, and the blue September morning beyond it, past 1,000 faces frozen in every degree of horror and delight, her head high, her step unhurried. Leaving me standing at the altar in my costly coat with the ring still in my glove, and the vow unspoken, and the whole vast machinery of my certainty shattered around my feet like dropped china, the bishop stood agape, his lawn sleeves trembling, the book open and useless in his hands. Somewhere behind me a dowager gave a small strangled shriek, and someone else began, unforgivably, to laugh. The church rose into an uproar, a rising surf of gasps and whispers and scraping pews, and one clear voice crying, "Good God!" And through all of it I did not move. I could not. I stood rooted at the step of my ancestor's altar, and I watched the small unhurried figure in cream grow smaller down the nave, and I heard the great door groan open upon its hinges, and I saw the flood of white daylight pour in around her as she passed through it, and then she was gone. And the door swung to behind her, and Anthony, 5th Duke of Rexford, who had never in 35 years of life been refused anything, stood at an altar, before the bishop and half of England, and was, for the first time, refused. A man who is refused in private may recover himself in private. He may go home and sulk or drink or ride his horse into a lather, and no one need be the wiser, and by breakfast he may have arranged his face and his story into something he can live behind. I was allowed no such mercy. I was refused before 1,100 people, under my own roof of stone, with the bishop of the diocese as witness and every scandal monger in 3 counties taking notes, and understood, standing there at the emptied altar with the great door still shuddering in its frame, that whatever had just happened to me was not going to remain a thing between 2 persons. It was going to become the property of England, and England, I may say, took possession of it with a greed and a glee I had not known the nation possessed. The story was in London before I was. I do not know by what infernal express it travelled, whether by post or by pigeon or by the simple demonic velocity of a good piece of malice, but I have since been assured that it was told at 3 separate dinner tables in town that very night, and that by the following evening a wit at White's had already coined the phrase that would follow me for a 12-month, the Duke who expected obedience, and that money was being laid, at generous odds, on whether I should die a bachelor of chagrin. Within the week there was a caricature in the print shop windows of Mrs. Humphreys in St. James's, which I did myself the exquisite injury of going to see. It showed a vast, scowling, overdressed figure, unmistakably myself, standing at an altar with one gloved hand thrust out in command, and beneath it the legend, "I expect obedience," and down the aisle, drawn very small and very upright, and I was forced to concede rather well, walked a slim figure in a bridal veil, and issuing from her mouth in a neat scroll were the 3 words that had become, "God help me," a catchphrase, a thing shouted by apprentices after carriages, sung to a tune in the cheaper theatres, worked into the patter of every wag from Bath to Newcastle. I do not. I stood in that shop in a plain coat with my hat pulled low, and I looked at the thing, and I understood that I had been made, in the space of 7 days, from the most feared man in England into the most laughed at, and that the distance between those 2 conditions, which I had always imagined to be immense, was in fact a single unhurried walk down a church aisle. I had, moreover, enemies. A man does not rule absolutely for 16 years without collecting them, as a ship collects barnacles, and they fell upon the business with a rapture that would have been touching in a better cause. Men whom I had cut at Newmarket, or overborne in committee, or bested at cards, or merely failed to remember the names of now discovered in themselves a tender solicitude for my feelings that required them to inquire after them at length in public, with grave faces and dancing eyes. Lord Farringdon, whose bill I had strangled in the Lords the previous session, was heard to observe that it was a great pity, a very great pity, but that his Grace had always been a man who valued plain speaking in a woman, and had certainly got it. A marchioness whose daughter I had passed over in my brisk survey of the marriage market, passed over, I am now certain, with an unforgivable want of ceremony, remarked in a dozen drawing-rooms that she had always thought Miss Kerr a young woman of most uncommon sense. The kindest thing said of me, I believe, was that I had been humbled, and I record it as a measure of the state I was then in that I heard the word humbled as the deadliest insult of the lot, when it was in truth the only accurate word spoken about me in the whole of that abominable autumn. My first passion, and I will not dress it up, for I have promised myself an honest account, was rage. Not hot rage, I have never been a hot man. My rage ran cold, the way deep water runs cold, and it ran all the deeper for having nowhere to go. I raged at Sir Godfrey, who came oiling to Rexford House 2 days after with his hat in his hands and his forehead damp, full of apology and disclaimer and the information, offered as though it were a comfort, that the ungrateful girl had run quite mad, and should be brought to heel and made to see reason. I dismissed him from my house and, in due course, from a good deal else. I raged the bishop, who wrote me a letter of such tortured delicacy, so full of Christian sympathy and unmistakable realish, that I burnt it. I raged at the guests, at the laughers, at the dowager who had shrieked and the young fool who had cried good God, at the whole feathered and superfined mob, who had come to see me married and been so much better entertained. But chiefly and most coldly, and most uselessly, I raged at her. For consider, I put it to myself 100 times in those first black nights, pacing the long gallery under the portraits of men who had never in their lives been laughed. Consider the sheer, the towering, the almost sublime effrontery of the thing. I had offered this woman everything. I had lifted her out of debt and dependence and a guardian's oily keeping. I had offered her a coronet, 4 estates, precedence over every woman in the room for the rest of her natural life. I had asked in return only that she should acknowledge, in the plain words the Church itself supplied, that a wife owes her husband obedience, which was not my invention but the settled law of God and England, printed in the very book the bishop held, and she had said no. Not privately, not with tears, not with some tender plea to be spared a word that frightened her, any of which I might have understood and even, in my fashion, forgiven. She had said it in public in the flattest voice imaginable, and then she had walked away, walked as though I were a puddle she was stepping around, and left me to the wolves. It was not refusal. Refusal I might have borne. It was dismissal. She had weighed me, the Duke of Rexford, entire, with all my honours and acres upon me, and she had found me not worth the saying of a single vow, and she had let the whole world see her do it. There is no injury like being found not worth a lie. And yet, here is the thing I could not get past, the splinter I could not work out of the flesh, the fact that turned in me through all those sleepless nights like a key I could not stop the turning of. She had not been afraid. I kept returning to that. I had spent 35 years watching men and women arrange their faces against me, the tenants' careful respect, the steward's tremor, the courtier's bright anxious flattery, the whole vast apparatus of deference that surrounds a duke as the air surrounds the earth, so constant that he ceases to feel it as we cease to feel the air. Every soul I had ever met had, in some corner of themselves, been managing me, placating, angling, taking care. And this one woman, alone of all the human beings I had encountered, had looked me in the face at the very summit of my power, with everything to lose and nothing to gain, and had not managed me at all. She had simply told me the truth as she saw it and gone out into the daylight. I had thought, in my folly, that I wanted a wife of spirit for the ornament of the thing, a spirited creature broken to my hand. I had never once, in all my calculations, reckoned with what it would be to encounter a spirit that would not break, and I found, to my confusion and my slow creeping dismay, that I could not stop thinking about it. That is the part I could least forgive her, and it took me longest to admit. It would have been simpler if I had merely hated her. Hatred is a tidy passion. It points one way and leaves the rest of a man's mind free, but I did not merely hate her. I lay awake and I reconstructed her face in the grey window light of Sir Godfrey's saloon, weighing me clause by clause like a document she meant to read to the end. I reconstructed the level grey look she had given me on the chancel step, the question with no words, and I saw, too late, that it had been a last honest offer, and that I had answered it with the nod of a general reviewing troops, and I felt for the first time in my life the particular heat of having been not wronged but weighed, and found wanting, by someone whose judgment I could not dismiss as beneath me. That was intolerable. A duke may be hated by his inferiors. It is nearly a duty of the office. But she had not treated me as an inferior treats a superior. She had treated me as an equal treats a fool. And the horror of it, the slow-spreading, sleepless horror, was that some cold clear voice at the very bottom of me, a voice I had 35 years successfully silencing, kept whispering that she might be right. What had become of her I learned in pieces, over weeks, as such things reach a man who is too proud to ask and too obsessed not to listen. She had not, it seemed, gone mad, whatever Sir Godfrey chose to put about. She had walked out of St. Anne's into the September morning, and she had got herself, by some means, the 2 miles to the house of a Mrs. Pettigrew, a widowed friend of her late mother's, a woman of small means, and, it must be said, considerable courage, for to take in the Rexford jilt was to make oneself unfashionable for a season. And there Susanna Kerr had sat down, so far as I could discover, declined utterly to be sorry. That was the detail that reached me and would not leave. She had not wept or hidden, or written the abject letters that everyone assumed and half hoped for. Sir Godfrey had gone to her in a fury. I was told to threaten and to bully. The debts were still owing, the sister's portion still unsecured. The whole crushing machinery still hers to bear, and now with the added ruin of a public disgrace laid over it, and she had heard him out and told him, quite calmly, that she was very sorry for the trouble to her sister and sorry for nothing else, that she had promised before God to marry the man, but had never promised to lie to him, and that when a bridegroom announces at the altar that he expects obedience, he has been so obliging as to inform his bride exactly what she is being asked to become, and that she, for her part, declined to become it, and would take the consequences, of which she was under no illusion there would be many. There was more and worse that came to me in the same slow-leaking fashion, and every particular of it lodged and stayed. Her sister, girl of 17, I gathered, gentle where Susanna was flint, and wholly innocent of the whole affair, had been on the point of a modest engagement to a curate's son, and the family of that son had grown suddenly cool, discovering in themselves scruples about an alliance with a house so publicly disgraced. Invitations that had once come to Miss Kerr came no longer. Tradesmen who had extended credit against the certainty of a ducal marriage now presented their accounts with a new and pointed promptness. Mrs. Pettigrew's small circle of the respectable but poor drew, some of them perceptibly away, unwilling to be splashed by the passing wheel. And through all of it, I was reliably informed, Susanna did not complain, and did not apologize, and did not once send to me, not a line, not a message, not the softening word that would have cost her nothing and might have bought her everything back. She took in sewing. She let it be known, with a composure that half the county found maddening and the other half secretly magnificent, that she had made her choice with her eyes open and would not insult it by whining over the bill. That a woman should ruin herself I could comprehend. The world is full of women ruined. That a woman should ruin herself deliberately, and then decline to be pitied for it, was outside the whole of my experience, and I turned it over and could make nothing of it that did not, infuriatingly, redound to her credit. I heard that speech at 4th or 5th hand, softened and hardened and mangled by every mouth it passed through, and I have no notion how much of it she truly said. But I believed the spine of it then, and I believe it now, because it was of a piece with everything I had seen of her, and because, this is the point, it did not spare her. Anyone inventing a heroine would have given her an escape, a fortune, a waiting lover, some soft place to fall. Susanna had none. She had defied me into the teeth of her own ruin. She had chosen scandal and hardship and a widow's spare room over a coronet, not because the coronet came cheap, but because it came with a price she had looked at squarely and refused to pay. And whatever I told myself in my rage about impertinence and ingratitude and madness, I could not make that refusal contemptible. Contempt requires that one look down, and I found when I tried to look down at Susanna Kerr that I could not manage the angle. I should like to record that this dawning respect softened me, that the sleepless weeks worked in me some early miracle of humility, and I resolved to leave the poor, brave woman in peace and mend my own arrogant soul. They did not, and I did not, and I will not pretend they did. What happened in me was meaner and more human and, I am afraid, more comic than that. Somewhere near the end of that first black month, pacing my gallery for the 100th time under the painted eyes of my ancestors, I stopped raging at the injury and began, instead, to be unable to bear the last word. That was the whole of it, stripped of its finery. She had said I do not, and she had walked out, and she had won. For it was a victory. The whole of England had scored it a victory. The print shops had framed it as a victory. And I, Anthony, 5th Duke of Rexford, who had never lost anything in my life, could not, would not, did not know how to close my eyes upon a contest in which the other party had walked off the field with the trophy and left me standing in the mud. It was not that I wished her ill. It was that I could not let it end there. The account was open, and I have never in my life left an account open. And so I did what such a man does, which is to take the pettiest impulse of his nature and dress it in the robes of principle until he cannot tell the one from the other. I persuaded myself, sitting up at last one grey dawn with the candles guttered and a decision hardening in me like frost, that the matter was at bottom a question of order. The world had a shape, and in that shape a wife did not shame a husband before the altar of God and walk out into the sunshine unanswered. To allow it to stand so was to leave a wrongness loose in the world, and the setting right of wrongness was, as I have told you, among the responsibilities I had absorbed with my mother's milk. She had defied me, and defiance, left unanswered, spreads. She must be brought. I used the word to myself without a flicker of shame, the word one uses of horses and hounds and rebellious tenants. She must be brought to heel. She must be made to see that she had erred, made to acknowledge it, made, in the end, to submit. And when she had submitted, the world would be set once more upon its hinges and I might sleep. I did not for one instant suspect that what I proposed to do was to seek out, and court, and spend upon the winning of the one human being alive who had ever told me the truth. I thought I was going to teach her a lesson. I rang for my man before the light was well up. I told him to have the travelling carriage ready, and to send word ahead to open the London house, for I found the county grown suddenly tedious to me. He was too well trained to show surprise, but I saw the small flicker of it, and I dare say all Rexford wondered, over its beer that night, why the Duke should run to town in the teeth of the very scandal. He might have sat out in dignified seclusion in the country. Let them wonder. I stood at my window while the grooms brought the horses round in the raw morning, and I looked east toward the road that led to town and to Mrs. Pettigrew's spare room and to the small upright figure who had walked away from me down a church aisle without once looking back. And I felt something that I mistook then entirely for the cold satisfaction of a man about to correct an error. I know now what it truly was. It was the first quickening of a man who has, at long last, at 35 years of age, found a locked door he could not open with his hand, and who has resolved, with all the magnificent blindness of his kind, that he will therefore break it down. I did not yet understand that some doors are opened only from the inside, and only to those who have learned to knock. I understood nothing at all, in fact, except that I could not stay where I was. And I gave the order, and I got into the carriage, and I set out to bring Susanna Care to heel, and to begin, though I would not know it for a long while yet, my education. My first stratagem was the one that came most naturally to my hand, being the one I had used upon the whole world for 35 years, and it failed so completely, and so promptly, that I have never quite forgiven it for teaching me nothing. I summoned her. I did not go to Mrs. Pettigrew's narrow house in that unfashionable street off the Gray's Inn Road, for it did not occur to me that a duke should go anywhere. I sent my carriage, my second-best carriage, the town chariot with the arms upon the door, for I judged that the full state would look like anxiety, and anxiety was the one thing I would not confess, and I sent with it a note, sealed with the great seal which requested, in the civil imperative that had never in my life been refused, that Miss Care do me the honour of waiting upon me at Rexford House at 4 o'clock, upon a matter touching her family's interest. I chose the words with care. I thought them handsome. I thought, indeed, that in stooping to write them at all I was performing an act of magnanimity that history might one day struggle to credit. The carriage came back at 4:30 with the note inside it, unopened, and folded round it, a second note in a small upright hand I had last seen signing a marriage settlement she never meant to honour. It read, entire, Miss Kerr thanks His Grace of Rexford for the loan of his carriage, which she has not used, being at present very much occupied, and begs leave to observe that a matter touching her family's interest may be safely committed to paper, since paper, unlike Miss Kerr, may be commanded to attend at 4 o'clock. She was very obediently his, etc. I read it standing in my own hall with my hat still on, and my man watched me read it, and I was aware of the effort it cost me to arrange my face, and I was aware that he was aware, and the whole silent business was of a piece with everything that had befallen me since I had opened my mouth at that altar. She had turned my own instrument in my hand. She had taken the word obedience, my word, the word she had gone to war over, and she had signed herself with it, so that I could not even be angry without being ridiculous. I went into my library, and I did not ring for wine, though I wished to, and I sat a long while, and at the end of it I understood one thing only, which was that summoning her again would produce more of the same and better of the same, and that the woman had an inexhaustible magazine of it. So I abandoned command for commerce, which is the second refuge of the powerful, and reflected that if she would not come to be told she was in the wrong, she might be brought by being done a kindness she could not refuse. I made inquiry, discreet inquiry, through my man of business, who is paid handsomely to have no opinions and very nearly earns it, into the exact figure of the debts that hung about the Kerr family's neck. It was not a large sum to me. It would have been a large sum to almost anyone. To me it was a fortnight's indifference at the tables of my grandfather's generation. I directed that the notes should be quietly bought up, every one, from the tradesman and the money-lender and the disappointed curate's family who held the sisters' small settlement over them like a rod, and that they should be cancelled, and that the cancelled papers should be sent to Miss Kerr in a plain packet with no name upon it, for I was learning, you observe, or believed I was. I thought the anonymity a masterstroke of delicacy. Let her be free of the whole weight of it, I reasoned, and let her wonder, and let the wondering do its slow work, and let her come at last to the only door in England from which such a mercy could have issued. The packet came back. It came back within the day, which meant she had guessed the hand behind it before she had well broken the string, and it came back with the notes inside it untouched and uncancelled, for she had not permitted me even to pay a farthing of them. She had, I later learned, gone herself to my man of business and repurchased the debts at the price he had given, on terms of her own arranging, so that within 24 hours she owed the money to a stranger of her own choosing rather than to me, and with the packet another of those small upright notes. His Grace is very good, it said, and Miss Kerr has no doubt that his charity, like his obedience, is a thing he expects to be gratefully received, but she finds she cannot afford it. She can afford her debts. She cannot afford to be his creature, which is what a woman becomes the moment she takes a great man's money, whatever the paper says, and as she declined the position when it was offered with a coronet upon it, she will hardly accept it now that it is offered wrapped in brown paper with the name torn off. She returns his kindness intact and remains, etc. I confess that I read that one twice, and that on the second reading a most unwelcome thing happened, which was that somewhere beneath the anger I felt the first faint, involuntary, appalling flicker of a smile. For she had seen the whole of it, the delicacy and the calculation folded inside the delicacy, the gift that was also a leash. She had seen straight through the brown paper to the man crouched behind it, and she had named him. And the naming was so exact that I could not even resent it without proving it. I had thought myself subtle. She had read me like a bill of fare. It was after the business of the debts that I understood I was not, in fact, conducting a campaign of correction at all, whatever I had told myself in my gallery. A man does not lie awake past 2 in the morning composing and discarding and recomposing letters to a person he merely wishes to instruct. I had begun to want to regard the way a starving man wants bread, and pretends he wants only to examine the loaf. But I would not yet own it, and so I went on with my stratagems, and my next was to attempt what the newspapers, had they known of it, would have called a rescue, and what I called, in the privacy of my own vanity, the restoration of Miss Kerr. It went thus. The world was still laughing. That was the wound under all the others, the laughter that would not die, the catchphrase shouted after carriages, and I conceived that if the world could be made to stop laughing at her, she must be grateful, since it was her ruin as much as mine. I could not stop it laughing at me. That horse had bolted and been made into a caricature and sold in the print shops for sixpence coloured. But I could, I thought, purchase her back into the drawing rooms. I let it be known, in the 3 or 4 houses that set the weather of the ton, that His Grace of Rexford considered Miss Kerr to have been treated shamefully, that he held her conduct to have been that of a woman of principle cruelly circumstanced, and that he would take it as a personal favour. I used the phrase, God help me, personal favour, as though favours were a currency I could mint at will, if she were once more received. It was, I promise you, a considerable thing to do. It cost me precisely the coin I could least spare, which was the admission, made in public and on purpose, that the jilted duke did not hold the jilting against the bride. Half the town thought me mad and the other half thought me magnificent, and both halves, I now perceive, were watching to see what she would make of it. What she made of it I discovered at Lady Sefton's, at the first great crush of the little season, where I had gone precisely because I had been told she would be there, restored, you observe, by my own decree, walking once more among the people who had cut her, and I had come to see my handiwork, I will be honest, to be thanked for it before witnesses, since the thanks refused in private might yet be extorted in public by the sheer pressure of 200 eyes. She was standing near the second window with old Mrs. Pettigrew at her elbow, in a gown I recognized, with the particular pang of a man who has begun to notice such things as a gown made over, the same grey silk she had worn to some assembly a year before, turned and freshened and worn again with an air that dared you to remark it, and she was not cowering. She was holding a small court of her own, 3 or 4 of the bolder wits gathered about her, for the town had discovered that the Rexford jilt was the most entertaining woman in London, and entertainment forgives a great deal in our world. It forgives, in the end, nearly everything but dullness. I crossed to her. The room, which had been a sea of noise, drew its breath and went shallow, the way a room does when it senses that the thing it came for is about to occur. I bowed. She curtsied, a perfect curtsy, exactly the depth my rank required and not 1 hair's breadth more. A curtsy that was itself a small masterpiece of insolence, for it conceded everything the world could see and nothing whatever that mattered. I said, and I had prepared it, I am ashamed to say I had prepared it in the carriage, that I was glad to see Miss Kerr abroad again, and hoped she found the world grown kinder. It was as near as my pride would come to say thank you. Kinder, your grace, she said, and her voice carried, not because she raised it, but because she had the trick, which I have never possessed, of being perfectly clear without appearing to try. I find the world exactly as kind as it was, which is to say it is kind to whoever is winning. A month ago it was very kind to you. Now, I am given to understand it has undertaken to be kind to me, and I am told I have your grace to thank for the arrangement, that you have gone about instructing the drawing rooms to receive me, as once you instructed a church to marry me. She let that sit half a beat, the wretched woman, the exact half beat a good actress leaves before the line that pays. It is very like you, if I may say so, to suppose that a door which was shut in my face may be reopened by your ordering it, and I have no doubt at all that the doors will obey you, for they are only doors. But you will forgive me if I do not walk through them merely because you have commanded them to gape. I came in tonight, your grace, on Mrs. Pettigrew's arm and my own 2 feet, invited by Lady Sefton, who is fond of me. I did not come in on your permission. Pray do not make me a present of an entrance I had already achieved. There was a sound in the room then, laughter. It was too dangerous for laughter, but the indrawn hiss of 200 people all deliciously scandalized at once, the sound of the tongue getting exactly what it had dressed and come out to get. And I stood there, the Duke of Rexford, in the middle of Lady Sefton's floor, having generously restored a woman who had just, with a perfect curtsy and a level voice, restored herself and declined my restoration in the same breath, and I understood that I had been beaten again, in public, for the 2nd time, by the same slight grey figure, and that the whole of London had watched me do it. And the truly maddening thing, the thing I carried home and could not put down, was that she had been just. Every word of it had been just. I had tried to make her a present of an entrance she had already achieved. I had come to be thanked for opening a door she had walked through on her own. She had not distorted me by a hair. She had merely described me accurately in company, and the accuracy was the whole of the injury. I might have hated her for it. I waited that night, riding home, for the cold rage to rise as it had risen at the altar, and it did not come. What came instead? I set it down because I promised the truth, and because it is the hinge of the whole history, was something nearer to exhilaration than to anger. An appalling lightness, the sensation of a man who has spent his life fencing with people paid to lose and has at last, unexpectedly, at 35, been touched. I had not been so awake in years. I had crossed that floor meaning to command a hearing, and been refused a hearing, and been made ridiculous, and I ought by every law of my nature to have gone home wretched, and instead I lay in the dark reconstructing every word she had said, not to nurse the wound but because the words were good, because they were better than any I had heard in a decade of flattery, because she had done to me in public what no one had dared do to me in private, and had done it with a wit so clean it left no ragged edge. I understood somewhere in that long night that I had been going about the thing precisely backward. You cannot command such a creature. You cannot buy her. She gives the money back. You cannot rescue her. She has rescued herself before you arrive, and will tell you so. There was only one thing in the whole world I had never once had to do to any human being, and it was the only thing that had the smallest chance of answering here, and the word for it, when I finally let myself shape it in the dark, tasted as strange in my mouth as a foreign coin. I should have to persuade her. I should have to earn it. I should have to charm a woman who had every reason on earth to be armored against me, and the wit to see any charm coming from a mile off, and name it aloud in a crowded room. So I set myself, with a humility that was 3 parts calculation and 1 part something I did not yet have a name for, to learn how it was done. And I began, as such campaigns properly begin, by contriving to meet her where neither summons nor money nor patronage could serve me, on ground where I should have nothing to offer but myself, and should have to make that answer, which was a thing no one had ever required of me before, and which I found, when I came to try it, that I did not in the least know how to do. My first attempt was at Hatchard's bookshop in Piccadilly, of a wet Thursday, whither I had ascertained by means, I will not dignify, that she went most weeks to stand at the shelves and read the books she could no longer buy, and to which I went, for the first time in my adult life, not as the Duke of Rexford come to purchase whatever the shop contained, but as a man who wished, very much and very foolishly, to be spoken to by a woman who did not wish to speak to him. I found her in the corner where the poetry stood, with a volume open in her gloved hands and the rain loud on the window, and I discovered, drawing near, that my heart was performing an office I could not remember requiring of it since I was a boy, and that I had not the smallest notion what I meant to say. "You are following me, your grace," she said, without looking up from the page, before I had come within 6 feet of her. "It is a very poor concealment. You stand out in a bookshop like a bishop in a barracks. I heard the whole room stop breathing when you came in, which is generally the way one knows you have entered any room, and I said to myself, there is either a fire or a duke, and as no one is running, it must be the duke." Now she looked up, and there was in her grey eyes not the cool contempt I had been schooling myself to endure, but something worse and far more dangerous, a bright, wicked, unmistakable relish, the look of a duellist who has found, against all expectation, a blade worth crossing. "Well, you have run me to earth among the poets. It seems a great waste of a duke. What do you want that you cannot command and cannot buy, and have been so instructive as to demonstrate to all of London that you cannot compel?" And I, who had come with nothing prepared and everything at stake, heard myself answer, truthfully, which astonished me more than it can possibly have astonished her, a conversation miscare, only that I find, to my very great inconvenience, that it is the one thing I possess no means of obtaining, and the only thing I have discovered I want. She did not answer at once. The rain came down, and for the length of one breath, before either of us remembered to be armoured, I saw her look at me as though I had said something she had not expected a man like me to be capable of saying, and I saw in the same instant that she saw me see it, and that neither of us knew now what to do with a fight that had, without permission, begun to be enjoyed by both parties at once. We had the conversation. I did not, in the event, obtain it that Thursday, for she closed her book upon her thumb and told me plainly that a bookshop was no place to be stared at by 200 spines and one duke, and that if I wished to be tolerated I might walk her as far as the corner where Mrs. Pettigrew waited under an awning, and no further. I walked her as far as the corner. It was the longest 100 yards I have ever travelled and the shortest, and I remember it better than I remember my own coronation, which cost £40,000 and taught me nothing whatever. What I learned in that 100 yards and in the dozen meetings that came after it, for she permitted a dozen grudgingly, each one wrung from her as though I were dunning her for a debt she disputed, was that I had been a stranger to conversation the whole of my life. I had presided over talk. I had received it, adjudicated it, closed it with a sentence when it wearied me, as a man closes a window against a draught. I had never once been answered back by a person who did not, in the answering, keep half an eye upon my face to see how the answer went down. Susanna kept no eye upon my face at all, or rather she kept both eyes upon it and was wholly indifferent to what she found there, which is a different and far more terrible thing. She said what she thought. She said it whether it flattered me or gutted me, and she watched the words land with the mild scientific interest of a woman noting where a stone falls in a pond, and then she said the next thing, which was generally worse. "You have never been contradicted," she told me on the second or third of these walks, as we went along the edge of the Green Park in a thin March sun with Mrs. Pettigrew dawdling 20 prudent paces behind. "It is not your fault, precisely, any more than it is a hothouse peach's fault that it has never felt a frost, but it has made you a certain shape. You put a question as though the answer were already engraved somewhere, and I had only to read it off. You cannot imagine, truly you cannot, I have watched you fail to imagine it, that a reasonable person, in full possession of the facts, might simply look at the matter and disagree with you. When I do it you get a particular expression, here, about the brows, as though the clock had struck 13. And what expression do you suppose you get," I said, "when I have the effrontery to disagree with you?" "Oh, I dare say I am insufferable," she said at once, without the smallest discomposure. "I never claimed to be pleasant. I claim to be right, which is quite another article and much rarer." And she laughed, not the polished ripple the drawing-rooms manufacture on demand, but a real laugh. Surprised out of her, and I found that I had walked 4 steps without attending to anything in the world but the sound of it, and that I would have paid, to hear it again, a sum that would have made my man of business turn grey. That was the thing I could not have foreseen and cannot now fully explain, though I have had years to try. I had wanted, all my life, to be agreed with, had built a household, a county, a whole revolving system of dependents and clients and toad-eaters expressly to secure it. And here was the one creature in England who would not agree with me about the colour of the sky if she thought it wanted qualifying, and I discovered that her disagreement was sweeter to me than a lifetime of the other thing. When she yielded a point, which she did, occasionally, and always cleanly, never with the sulky rearguard concessions of the vain, I felt as though I had been knighted. When she took one from me I felt the particular joy of a man who has finally, after long searching, found an opponent who will not let him win by default, and there is no pleasure in the whole catalogue of pleasures to touch it, though I had tasted most of the others and found them, I now saw, thin. There was a warmth in it too, beneath the crossing of blades, that stole up on us both, and that neither of us named. She had a way, when I said a thing that pleased her against her will, of pressing her lips together to keep the pleasure off them, and failing, and knowing she had failed, and being cross about it. And I would have given the Rexford diamonds to provoke that particular struggle, and did provoke it, shamelessly, whenever my wit could compass it. Once, near the Ranelagh gate, I made her some observation upon the folly of a mutual acquaintance. A thing not especially clever but timed to a hair, and she laughed before she could stop it and then said, "You are trying to make me like you, your grace, and I will tell you it is a low, underhand proceeding and beneath a man of your rank." And I said, "It is the only honest labour I have undertaken in my life, and I find I am not above it." And she looked at me sidelong for a long moment and said nothing at all, which from Susanna Kerr was a whole oration. I walked the rest of that street, I remember, upon air. I who had walked upon carpets my whole life and thought them soft, and she gave as good as she got and better, for she had the advantage of me in every weapon but rank, and rank was the one weapon she had forbidden me to use. She teased me about my consequence, my duking, she called it, as though it were a verb, a thing I did, like snoring, and she did it so exactly, catching the very turn of my head when I was about to be grand, that I learned to feel the grandness coming, and to strangle it in the cradle for fear she should see it and christen it aloud. She was educating me, in short, out of the whole apparatus of 35 years, and doing it by no means gentler than mockery and no means crueller than laughter, and I submitted to the schooling as I had never submitted to anything, and called it in my own heart the happiest term I had ever kept. I will set down one of these conversations entire, or as near entire as memory serves, because it was the one in which I understood, privately, in the silence behind my own face, not saying a word of it aloud, precisely what had happened to me. We had got, God knows how, onto the management of my Rexford estates, and she had asked me, not idly, how many families lived upon them, and I had told her, and she had asked what became of the old among them when they could no longer work. And I had begun to answer in the rounded confident manner of a man reciting a thing he has never had to defend, and she had stopped me. No, she said, you are telling me what the arrangement is. I asked what becomes of them. Those are not the same question, and you know they are not, or you would not have reached so quickly for the arrangement. And I looked at her and I found, this is the part I had never met before in any human transaction, that I could not fob her off. Not because she had power over me. She had none. She had not a shilling nor a name nor a single card in her hand but her own clear sight. But precisely because she had nothing to gain by flattering me and nothing to lose by pressing me, her question had a weight that no courtiers ever carried. She wanted the true answer. She was, I slowly perceived, the only person I had spoken to in 20 years who wanted the true answer, and not the answer that would please me or profit her, and I gave it to her, gave her the truth, which was that I did not entirely know what became of them, that I had left it to my steward, that I had signed what was put before me and ridden past the cottages without looking in, and she did not scold me, which I could have borne, and did not forgive me, which I did not want. She only nodded once, as though I had at last said something worth the standing still to hear, and said, then that is a thing you might find out, and we walked on. And I rode home that night and wrote to my steward the first letter I had ever written him that was not an instruction but a question, and I understood, sealing it, that this woman had in the space of a fortnight's grudging walks made me want to be a better steward of my own name than I had troubled to be in 35 years of holding it, and that I would rather be asked a hard question by her than told an easy truth by anyone else alive. That was the whole of it laid bare. I did not want her obedience. I had thought I wanted it. I had roared for it at an altar and been justly humiliated, and now I saw that if she had given it to me, if she had turned, tomorrow, into a soft agreeing thing that rid my face and shaped herself to it, I should have lost in the very hour of winning the one thing I had come, without knowing it, to prize above every écrin I owned. I did not want a subordinate. I had 1,000 subordinates, and they had between them not furnished me a single hour so alive as the worst quarter of an hour she had given me. I wanted a match. I wanted, for the first and only time in my life, to be met, argued with, checked, sharpened, answered, by a mind that would never once bow to mine, and was the finer for it. I wanted, though I would sooner have been broken on a wheel than say the word, a wife who was an equal, and the wanting of it had crept up on the imperious Duke of Rexford so quietly, disguised the whole way as sport, that it had me by the throat before I knew I had been stalked. And she, I did know it then, she told me long after, but I will put it here where it belongs, she was in the same case and more frightened of it than I, and with better cause. She had walked out of a wedding to keep her own soul in her own keeping. She had built her small hard freedom out of nothing, out of a made-over gown and a sharp tongue and old Mrs. Pettigrew's spare room, and it was all she had, and she felt it. She told me, beginning to be in danger, not from my rank nor my money, which she had already proved to herself she could refuse, but from the far more insidious circumstance that she had begun to look forward to Thursdays. She had begun to save up things to tell me. She had caught herself, she said, laughing at a thing 3 days after I had said it, alone over the darning, and had been so appalled at the discovery that she had pricked her finger through the thimble. We were neither of us safe. We were both, in the plain sense, falling, and each of us kept it hidden from the other with a care that was itself the surest sign of the disease, and the whole delicate impossible thing hung, that April, upon my not spoiling it. I spoiled it. I want to be exact about how, because the fault was entirely mine, and it was not a small mean fault of the kind a man can shrug off. The very grain of my nature reasserting itself at the worst possible moment, like a river that has been dammed and civilized, and made to run through ornamental channels, and that, the instant one's back is turned, remembers it is a river, and goes where it always meant to go. It happened thus. I had learned, one learns everything following such a woman. I could have written her biography, that the debts she had so proudly repurchased from my man of business, on terms of her own arranging, were pressing her hard, that the stranger she owed them to was less patient than I should have been, that the sister's small settlement was in jeopardy, and with it the sister's marriage, that Susanna was, beneath the wit and the level grey eyes, lying awake over figures exactly as I had lain awake over letters. I could not bear it. That is the truest sentence I can write about that April. I could not bear that she should suffer a want it was in my power to end with a stroke of the pen. And so, the old machine in me turning over as smoothly as it had turned my whole life, I acted. I did not send brown paper this time. I had learned that much. I was proud of myself for having learned it, which ought to have warned me. I went to her, went in person, in the plain travelling coach, sat in Mrs. Pettigrew's narrow parlour with my hat on my knee like a suitor, which I told myself I was, and I laid it all before her openly, as one lays a plan before a partner. I had, I told her, given the whole matter my consideration. I had a scheme that answered every difficulty. The debts should be settled, not by charity, I was quick to say, having learned my lesson, but as a proper provision. The sister's settlement should be secured. A certain small property of mine in the county, a snug thing quite respectable, should be put in trust for her own use, so that she need never again lie awake over a stranger's impatience, nor make over a gown, nor count a shilling as long as she lived. And then, having arranged the whole of her life to my satisfaction and cleared, as I imagined, every obstacle from the path, I asked her, again, to marry me. I asked it, I thought, beautifully. I asked it as a man asks who has thought of everything, who has left his intended nothing to do but be happy, who has, in short, settled her. I saw it go wrong before she said a word. I had grown by then, fluent in her face, and I watched something come down over it, a shutter of frost, the very frost she had once told me the hothouse peach had never felt, and I felt it, the frost, and did not understand it, and blundered on into it. You need not thank me, I said. Which I meant for graciousness, and which was, I now know, the single most damning thing I could have chosen, for it revealed that somewhere in me, under all the reformation I had been expecting thanks, had expected that she, having been so thoroughly relieved, so completely provided for, so entirely arranged, would at last be grateful, and being grateful, would be soft, and being soft, would be mine. She stood up. She did it quietly, which was worse than if she had flung the chair. "Let me be sure I have understood your grace," she said, and her voice had gone very clear and very cold, the courtroom voice, the voice she had used on Lady Sefton's floor, and I felt my heart drop through the parlour floor and keep falling. "You have investigated my debts, without my leave. You have measured my sister's settlement. You have selected a property, a snug thing, quite respectable, and determined that I shall live in it. You have disposed of my whole future, down to the gowns I shall not have to turn, and you have done it all before setting one foot in this room, so that by the time you asked me anything, there was nothing left to ask, because you had already decided it. And then, having arranged me as you would arrange a drainage scheme or a plantation of oaks, you have asked me to be grateful." She drew one breath. "This is the same thing, your grace. Do you not see it? It is the very same thing you did at the altar, only you have learned to smile while you do it. You do not want to marry me. You want to acquire me and settle me and have me be thankful for the settling. You have not asked me to share your life. You have offered to manage mine. And I would rather," and here for the first and only time in all our long war, her voice was not quite steady, "I would rather owe money to the hardest stranger in London for the rest of my days than be the thing a great man won and fixed and expect to say thank you. I walked out of one church to keep from being managed. I am not such a fool as to walk into your parlour and let it be done to me in an armchair. And I sat there with my hat on my knee, in the wreck of the most careful, most generous, most reformed proposal I had ever conceived, and understood, far too late, that I had not reformed at all, that I had only put a better coat on the same old creature, and that in the very hour I had come nearest to earning her, I had reached, from the deepest habit of my blood, to buy her instead. And that she had seen the old autocrat under the new suitor as plainly as she had once seen the man crouched behind the brown paper, and had drawn back from him, and was right, entirely right, to draw back, and that I had, with my own 2 hands, thrown down the one thing I had ever built worth keeping, and had not the smallest idea, sitting in that cold parlour with the frost between us, how a man goes about picking such a thing up again, or whether it can be picked up at all. She went to the door of the little parlour and opened it, and stood with her hand upon it, and did not look at me, which was its own kind of mercy and its own kind of sentence. "Mrs. Pettigrew will see you out," she said. "I do not think, Your Grace, that we need meet again. I am obliged to you for the walks." They were, and there she stopped, and I saw her decide not to give me the rest of the sentence, whatever it had been, and close her mouth upon it as a person closes a hand upon a coin they have thought better of spending. "Good day," she said instead, and went out, and I heard her feet upon the stair, steady, unhurried, not running, which somehow undid more than running would have done, for a woman runs from a thing that frightens her and walks away only from a thing she has finished with. I sat on in the cold parlour a while longer than was decent. Old Mrs. Pettigrew came at last, and stood in the doorway with her knitting held against her breast like a shield, a small, fierce, ancient woman who had taken in a penniless girl and asked nothing for it, and she looked at me, a dutuk, in her parlour, with his hat on his knee, with an expression I had never in my life been favoured with, which was pity, unmixed with the smallest particle of awe. "You had better go home, sir," she said, not unkindly, which was the worst of it. "There's nothing here for you now." And I got up and thanked her and went. I will not pretend I understood it at once. A man does not shed 35 years in an afternoon, and my first motions, driving back through the wet streets with the blinds up and the lamps coming yellow through the drizzle, were the motions of the creature I had always been. I began, before I had gone a mile, to plan. It is what I did. It is what I had always done. A thing went wrong and I reached for the levers of the world to set it right, and the levers came, as they always came, obligingly to my hand. I would write to her. No, a letter could be refused unopened, and would be. I would call again in a week, when the heat had gone out of it, and reason with her. She was a reasonable woman, she prided herself upon it. I would lay the thing out again and show her she had mistaken me. I would reduce the settlement. I would make the property a smaller one, a plainer one, so that it should not look like a purchase. I would find, through my man of business, who her hard creditor was, and buy the debt after all, quietly, and never tell her, so that the pressure should simply lift from her life like a fog, and she should never know whose hand had waved it off. And there, somewhere upon the Kensington Road, in the middle of that last handsome scheme, I caught myself and went cold, and cold in a new place, a place I had not known was in me to be cold in, for it was the same thing. It was always only the same thing. I had sat in her parlour not an hour since and been told, in words a child could not have mistaken, that the wrong I had done her was precisely this, the arranging, the managing, the settling of her life from above while calling it love. And here, before the horses had got me home, I was already deep in the arranging of it again, only more cleverly, more secretly, so that she should not catch me at it. I had heard her. I had heard every word. And the machine in me had listened to the whole indictment, and then, the instant the noise of it died away, set placidly about committing the identical crime by stealth. I had not been planning how to make amends. I had been planning how to win. That was the word that stopped the horses in me, though the real ones went on. Win. I had used it to myself all along the whole spring, under the wit and the walks and the fine talk of matches and equals. I had thought of her, God help me, as a thing to be won, a hard case. The one holdout in a life of easy surrenders. I had laid siege to her as I had laid siege to everything, with patience where force would not serve and charm where patience flagged, and I had called the siege courtship and been proud of my own gentleness in the conduct of it, and it had been a siege from first to last, and she had known it. Of course she had known it. She had told me at the Ranelagh gate, laughing, "You are trying to make me like you. and it is a low, underhand proceeding. She had seen the campaign inside the courtship before I had, and had gone on walking with me anyway, at hazard to her own peace, hoping, I think now she was hoping, that the man might in the end outgrow the general, and the man had not. At the first sight of her in trouble, the general had mounted and ridden out and done the one thing generals do, which is to reduce a fortress, and she had watched the flag go up over her own life, and had done the only thing left to a soul that means to remain a soul, which is to burn the fortress rather than surrender it. I did not, I confess, achieve this discovery all in one clean stroke, as I have set it down. The setting down of a thing gives it an order the living of it never has. In truth, I went home and, catching the machine at its planning, was only troubled by it, not yet converted, and the next morning, and the morning after, the general in me kept remounting in the grey hour before I was properly awake, and I let him ride a little way each time before I remembered and called him back. I wrote letters. I wrote, I think, 9 of them, over 4 days, and burned 9 of them, and the burning of each taught me a fraction of what the writing had not. The first were frankly the old thing in a new hand, reasoned, lucid, unanswerable, laying the case for our marriage as I might have laid a brief, and I saw, reading them over, that a letter one cannot answer is only a command in better clothes, and put them in the fire. The next were worse, for they were humble, and I discovered that my humility, when I examined it upon the page, was merely pride performing a bow, a great man stooping, and inviting her to be moved by the stoop, so that even my abasement was a lever I meant to work upon her. That went into the fire too, and I sat a long time after it, understanding that a man may kneel and still be trying to have his way, and that she would smell the trying upon me through any quantity of ink. And then, on the 5th day, before I had resolved anything at all, the matter was taken out of my hands, as I suppose it deserved to be. I sent my man, not to her, I had wit enough left for that, but to make the sort of quiet inquiry a man in my position can always make, and he came back with the news that Miss Kerr had left London. She had gone, it appeared, into the West, into Somerset, or thereabouts, to a widowed cousin of Mrs. Pettigrew's who kept a small school and wanted a woman to teach the little ones their letters and their globes, had accepted the post by return of post, packed her one trunk made over. I did not doubt it, no further gown, and gone, within the week, some 160 miles out of my reach, to earn her bread among other people's children for £30 a year and her keep. She had not fled to a relative who would shelter her, for she had none. She had not run home, for she had no home. She had simply removed herself, deliberately and at cost, to the one kind of place where a duke's coach could do nothing but stand ludicrous in the lane and be stared at by G's, had chosen labour and distance, and a narrow cot in a strange county over the snug respectable property I had pressed upon her, and had chosen them, I understood, precisely because they were hers, got by her own act, owing nothing to any man. She had rather teach the alphabet in Somerset, free, than be a duchess in a trust I had settled obliged, and my man told me, watching my face, as they all watched my face, that she was gone. I felt the ground I had meant to lay my next siege upon simply ceased to be there, and I was left standing over nothing, with all my apparatus of persuasion in my hands, and no fortress within 160 miles to turn it against. That was when I went home and did not plan any more. I sat up very late in the library at Rexford House with no candle lit but the one, and let the fire go down, and did a thing I had not done in 20 years, which was to sit still inside my own mind without reaching for anything, and look at what was there. What was there was this: that I did not, in fact, want to win her. That the wanting to win had been the disease and not the love. That they had grown up so tangled together that I had mistaken the one for the other, and that if I were ever to have her at all, I must tear them apart with my own hands and throw the worst of them into the fire. Because a thing won is a thing conquered, and a thing conquered belongs to the conqueror, and she had said it herself, standing by the cold grate. She would not be the thing a great man won and fixed and expected to thank him. She did not want to be my victory, and I saw, sitting there, that she was entirely right to refuse it, and more, that I did not, when I was honest, even want her to be my victory, for a victory is a dead thing, a fortress with the guns spiked, and what I loved in her was the one quality that no victory can leave standing, which was that she was free. It was her freedom I had fallen in love with, her ungovernableness, the clear grey eyes that weighed me and were not dazzled, and I had responded to that freedom, that ungovernableness, by trying to buy it a house and put it in trust and make it grateful, that is, by trying to end it. I had fallen in love with a wild thing for its wildness, and then set snares for it, and been wounded that it would not walk into them and thank me for the wire. I thought of her as I sat there, 160 miles off in a cold schoolroom, bending over some farmer's child in its slate. Tired, poor, unthanked and free, and I found that I could not wish her back into the warm trap I had built for her without wishing her, in the same breath, less than she was. That was a new thing to feel, and it hurt in a new way. I had always wanted the people I loved to be comfortable, by which I had meant provided for, by which I had meant beholden. And here was the first person I had ever wanted to be free before she was comfortable, free even of me, free even at the price of her never coming back. And the wanting of it was the first wholly unselfish motion my heart had made in 35 years, and it arrived as such things do, far too late to be of the smallest use to either of us. There is a particular horror in discovering that the thing you did in love was the cruelest thing you could have done, and that you did it because of the love and not in spite of it. I have caused, in my time, a good deal of ordinary pain. The pain a great man scatters carelessly behind him without turning his head, and I found, that night, that I could bear the memory of nearly all of it better than I could bear this, which I had done tenderly, with my whole heart in it, meaning nothing but her good. For the careless cruelties a man can mend. He can turn his head at last and see the harm and go back and do better. But this went down to the root. This was not a thing I had done. It was a thing I was. I had wanted my own way every hour of my life, in every particular. From the temperature of my bathwater to the disposition of 10,000 acres, and had got it. And the getting of it had become as natural to me and as invisible as breathing, so that I no longer even knew I was doing it. Could reach out and rearrange another human being's entire existence and honestly believe with a clear conscience and a warm heart, that I was making her a present. And I saw at last, as the fire went to red and then to grey, the whole size of what would be required, and it frightened me as no battle nor loss nor peril of my life had ever frightened me, because it was not a thing to be done once and have done. It was this, that I must give up getting my own way. Not in this or that, not as a concession gracefully, the way I had given up the brown paper and been so pleased with myself, but altogether at the root, in the one case where I wanted my way more than I had ever wanted anything on this earth. I wanted Susanna Kerr. I wanted her with a completeness that made every former wanting of my life look like a child fingering sweets in a shop window. And the whole terrible arithmetic of it was that I could have her only by ceasing to try to get her, that the one path to her ran directly away from every instinct I possessed. To pursue her was the injury. To press her was to prove her right. To fix her difficulties by stealth. To reason her out of her refusal. To lay siege in any of the 10,000 forms a clever, determined man can devise. All of it, every last maneuver, was simply the general riding out again, and would confirm her, rightly in the belief that I was what I had always been and could not help being. A man who took. I could not command her. That was the flat rock at the bottom of it, and I struck it at last and could go no lower. I had commanded, one way or another, every soul I had ever dealt with, had commanded them so long and so easily that I had come to think command the natural relation of myself to the world, as a man thinks the ground natural to his feet. And here was one person in creation whom I could not command by so much as the breadth of a hair, could not order, could not buy, could not charm past her own clear judgment, could not above all win, and she was the only person whose yes I had ever, in the whole of my life, actually needed. I might as well have commanded the tide up the Kensington Road. She would come to me if she came at all, of her own free choosing and by no act of mine, or she would not come, and there was not a duke's worth nor a king's worth of power in the world that could touch the matter one way or the other. It was wholly in her hands. I had spent my life arranging that nothing should ever be wholly in another's hands, and now the one thing I could not live easily without had passed, entirely and forever, out of my reach and into hers, and there was nothing I could do about it, nothing, except the one thing I had never done. I could offer, not arrange, not provide, not settle, not win, offer and stand back, and leave her free, truly free, freer than my presence had ever yet left her, to take it or to refuse it, knowing that if I did it honestly I might very well lose her for good, and this time no siege to lay. No second assault, no clever patient reduction of the walls, but only the finished fact of a door shut and the right, her right to have shut it. I should have to go to her and offer her a partnership and not a rescue, an equal's hand and not a benefactor's check. And I should have to do it in such a fashion that there was nothing in it for her to be grateful for, nothing to be relieved of, nothing bought or fixed or provided, so that if she said yes, it should be to me and not to my 10,000 acres, and if she said no, I should have to bow and take my hat and go, and let her keep her hard, precarious, unpurchased freedom, and count it. I made myself frame the thought entire there in the grey dawn, and it was like swallowing a stone. Count it a fair price for having, once in my life, loved something enough to leave it alone. I did not sleep. Toward morning I got up stiff from the cold chair and stood at the window while the square went from black to iron to a thin used-up daylight, and I understood that everything I knew how to do was now forbidden to me, and that the only road to the one thing I wanted led through the surrender of the very faculty by which I'd got everything else I had ever wanted, and that I must walk it with no weapon in my hand and no certainty at the end of it, and offer her not the victory I had been so proud to lay at her feet, but the far dearer and far more frightening gift that I had never once, in 35 ungoverned years, given any living soul, my own defeat freely handed over, with nothing asked in return for it. I went into Somerset in October, and I went alone. I took no coach with arms upon the panel. I hired a plain chaise at Bath and gave it up at the turn of the lane, and walked the last half-mile in the honest mud like any man on his own 2 feet, so that when I came into the village of Nethercombe there should be nothing about me to overawe a soul, no equipage, no liveried men, no announcement of consequence going before me down the street to soften the ground. I had learned that much, at least. A duke who arrives with his consequence has already begun to command the room before he has spoken, and I did not mean, this once, to command anything. I meant to arrive as small as I could make myself, which was not, I confess, very small, for a man of my height in a good coat is a conspicuous object in a Somerset lane, and the G's did stare, precisely as I had foreseen they would. The school was a low stone building beside the church, with a yard, and I stood at the wall of the yard a while like a poacher and watched her through the window before ever I went in. She did not know I was there. She was bent over a bench of small children, 6 or 7 of them ragged and clean, and she had a slate in her hand and was drawing something upon it, a map I think, or the shape of a letter grown enormous, and one of the little ones said a thing that made her laugh, and she laughed with her whole face, unguarded, the way she had never once laughed with me, who had spent a spring earning her smiles by the inch. She was thinner than she had been. Her gown was a schoolmistress's gown, brown, much mended, and there was chalk on her cuff and a strand of hair come down that she pushed back with her wrist without noticing. She looked tired. She looked poor. She looked entirely, formidably happy, in the plain hard-won way of a person who has bought her own bread and owes no one a farthing for it, and I stood at the cold wall and understood, watching her, that I had very possibly come 160 miles to be told to go home, and that she had every right in the world to tell me so, and that I would deserve it. I own that I very nearly did not go in at all. I had rehearsed the going in 100 times upon the road, and every rehearsal ended the same way, with her setting down her chalk and looking at me with the settled, finished patience of a woman looking at a thing she has done with, and it is a curious weakness in a man who has faced cannon that he may stand quaking at a low door in Somerset, because behind it is the only judgment on this earth he cannot appeal. But I had learned that autumn the difference between the courage that takes a thing and the courage that risks a thing, and found the second the rarer article by far, and got at last enough of it together to move my feet. A robin came and sat on the yard wall beside me and regarded me with its head on one side, wholly unimpressed, and I thought that is very nearly Mrs. Pettigrew, and it steadied me absurdly, and I went. I waited until the children were let out, shrieking, into the lane, and one small girl stopped square in front of me and asked, without the least awe, whether I was somebody's grandfather come to fetch them, and I said no, I was nobody's anything, come to see the teacher. And she considered this and told me the teacher was the best in the world and I had better not vex her, and ran off, and I took the counsel to heart, and then I went and stood in the doorway of the schoolroom, hat in hand, and said her name. She turned and went white. And then a great deal of color came up into her face, and she set the slate down very carefully upon the bench, as a person sets down a thing they are afraid of dropping, and she said, "You found me." Then a voice that was trying hard to be dry and did not entirely succeed. "I had rather supposed you would." "I did not find you," I said. "Mrs. Pettigrew's cousin's school is not a state secret, and I am ashamed that I once thought the finding of you was the difficult part. May I come in? I will go the instant you tell me to." I have said that to myself the whole way from Bath, that I will go the instant you tell me to, and I mean it, and I would be obliged if you would believe I mean it, though I know I have given you no reason on this earth to believe anything I say. She looked at me a long moment with the clear grey eyes weighing me as they had weighed me from the first, and then she said, "You may come in. You are letting the cold in." Shut the door, and I came in and shut the door, and we stood in the little chalk-smelling room among the empty benches, a duke and a schoolmistress, and I laid it down. I had thought, on the road, that I should have a speech. I had made several. I had burned them all, having learned what my speeches were worth. So I had none in the end, and only the truth, which is a poorer sounding thing than a speech, and the only thing she would have taken. "I have not come to persuade you," I said. "I want to say that first, because you will be waiting for it. The reasoning, the case, the lever worked in under your resolve. There is none. I have come to offer you a thing, and then to go away and let you alone with it, and whatever you decide, you will never hear from me again unless you send for me. I have done you a great wrong, and the wrong was this, that I loved you and could not tell the loving apart from the winning. And so I laid siege to you and called it courtship, and when you were in trouble I bought your trouble and called it care, and every step of it, every kindness, was a way of getting my own way, while persuading us both it was a way of giving. You saw it before I did. You were right to burn the fortress. I would have done the same in your place, and thought less of anyone who did not." She had gone very still. "Anthony," she said. She had never used my name before. It went through me like a blade. "Do not. Let me finish, and then I will go, and you need never hear it again. I have settled money on you." I said it plainly and saw her stiffen, and went on before she could throw it back at me. "Not on the marriage, not conditional upon anything. It is done, it is signed, it is beyond my reach and beyond my recall. 800 a year to you, Susanna Kerr, spinster, absolutely and forever, whether I ever set eyes on you again or no. If you marry a farmer, it is yours. If you marry no one, it is yours. If you tell me this hour to walk into the sea, it is still yours, and I cannot take it back, for I have made very sure I cannot. I have done it for one reason only, and it is not kindness. And it is not to buy you, for a thing you already own outright cannot be used to buy you. I have done it so that when I ask you what I am going to ask you, you may answer entirely free. You will never again in your life have to weigh a man's offer against the cold and the rent and the £30 a year. That weight is lifted, and it is lifted whatever you say to me. So that your no, if it is no, will cost you nothing, and your yes, if it were ever yes, could never be suspected by you or by me or by God of being anything but yours." The colour had gone out of her face again. She sat down slowly on the edge of a child's bench, which put her below me, and I at once went down on my heels so as not to stand over her, and crouched there absurd and enormous among the little benches, and she gave a sound that was half a laugh and half not. "And now the asking," I said, low. "I am asking you to marry me, not to be rescued by me, not to be provided for by me, not to be a duchess. You may have the coronet or throw it in the pond. I find I do not greatly care. I am asking you to be my equal and my partner and the other half of my judgment, to argue with me and check me and tell me when the general has got back on his horse, which he will, for a man does not unmake his whole nature in a single autumn, and I shall need watching to the end of my days. I am asking for a marriage of two wills and not one master, and I will tell you the one thing more, and then I have done. When I imagined our wedding, this last month, I could not get past a single word in it, the word they set in the woman's mouth, obey. I have struck it out. Not softened it, not reinterpreted it, struck it out and had it struck out, and the man who is to marry us knows he is to leave it on the shelf. You shall stand up in that church and vow to love me and to cherish me, if you can bring yourself to it, and nothing else, no obedience. Not a grain of it, not the shadow of the word, for I find I want no obedience from you and never truly did. I wanted your regard, and mistook it. the way a starving man mistakes every ache for the one hunger. I began this whole business, if you recall, by informing you that I expected obedience. I have come 160 miles to tell you I expect none. I expect nothing, I hope, but hope asks no permission and lays no siege, and if you send me away I shall carry it home, and it will trouble no one but me. I stood up then, my knees cracking like an old man's, and put my hat back on. That is all of it, I said. The money is yours in either case. Do not let it weigh with you a feather's breadth. I will be at the inn at Nether Stowey until Thursday, and after Thursday I will be gone, and you may write to me or you may not, and if you do not I will understand it perfectly and honour it and never come here again. Good day, Miss Kerr. I am more glad than I can say, to have seen you happy. It is the thing I ought to have wanted for you from the beginning, and did not, and want now. And I turned, and I went to the door, and I got my hand upon it, and it was the hardest single act of my life, that turning away. Harder than any battle, for every instinct I had ever obeyed was screaming at me to turn back and press, to add one word more, to make the case unanswerable, and I did not. I opened the door on the cold and made to go through it and leave her free. I stopped. I did not dare turn round. Shut the door, she said. You are letting the cold in again. You are the most cold-letting-in man I have ever known. I shut the door. I turned. She was standing now, and there were tears standing in the grey eyes and not falling, held there by sheer force of will, which was the most like her thing she had done yet, and her chin was up. 800 a year, she said, of my own, that no one can touch, and no obedience. And a man who will crouch among the infant benches and cross out the one word he began by demanding. Do you know, she said, and her voice broke and steadied. You have made it very much harder to refuse you, by making it so entirely possible. That was clever. I hope you did not mean it to be clever. I did not, I said. I am past being clever. It nearly killed me to walk to that door. I saw, she said. I have never seen you cost yourself anything before. I did not know you could. She came a step nearer among the benches. I did not walk out of a wedding once, because I hated the man, she said. I walked out because I would not say obey to anybody living, and be a thing owned, and thanked for my compliance. I have spent my whole life refusing to be got. And you have come here and offered me the one thing I never thought a man of your kind could offer, which is not to get me at all, to want me free more than you want me yours. She stopped an arm's length off and looked up at me, unbowed, sharp to the last, wet-eyed and steady. It is a great pity, she said, because I find that having been offered my freedom so completely, I no longer particularly want it. I appear to want you. It is very inconvenient. I had my life arranged. Susanna, I said, and could say no more. I will marry you, she said. On my own terms, which are these. I will go on teaching until Christmas, for I gave my word to the children, and I do not break my word to children even for dukes. You will not manage me. When you reach for the levers I shall name it aloud, every time, until you laugh, and you had better learn to laugh. And I keep the 800 a year in my own hand to the end of my life, not because I shall need it, but because as a woman should always be able to buy her own coach to the sea. Should she ever wish to drive into it. She put out her hand, not to be kissed, but to be shaken as one shakes on a bargain between equals. Those are my terms. Do you accept them? I accept them, I said, and took her hand, and did not kiss it, and shook it gravely, as one seals a treaty between two powers who mean to keep the peace by respecting the frontier, and then could not help myself and laughed, and she laughed too, the whole-faced unguarded laugh I had watched through the window and thought I should never be given, and it was given to me. And the giving of it was the only fortune I have ever come into that I did not somehow contrive to spoil. We stood a while longer among the little benches, not touching but for the one hand, saying the small foolish things that people say who have narrowly missed losing one another and can hardly yet believe they have not. And the light went off the whitewashed wall, and the chalk dust hung gold in it. And somewhere in the lane the children who did not know they had settled a duke's whole fate were quarrelling happily over a top. We were married in the little church at Nethercombe in the December. With the farmer's children, she had taught strewing what late berries the hedges could spare. And old Mrs. Pettigrew brought West in my warmest coach to sit in the front pew and glare at me with her diminishing pity, and I stood up at that altar a man of 35 who had got, in the whole course of his life, every single thing he had ever demanded, and who now demanded nothing, and received, therefore, everything. The parson read it through as I had asked. I had gone to him myself and stood over the very sentence, the only piece of stage managing I have permitted myself since, and I permit it to myself still, for it was a striking out and not a getting. And where the word obey should have stood there was a small clean silence, and into that silence, in her clear unfrightened voice that had refused a bridegroom once for the sake of it, Susanna said the two words I had left her free to say or to withhold, and they were not obey. And they never would be, and they were the truest thing anyone has ever said to me. I will, she said. And that was all, and it was everything. I have been, these 15 years, a man with a wife instead of a subject, and I recommend the exchange to any tyrant with the courage for it, which is a great deal more courage than tyranny requires. She names the general aloud. Still, when he mounts less often, but he is not dead, and I do not think now that he ever will be quite dead, only outnumbered, and I have learned, as she promised I should, to laugh. There is no word I gained at that altar that I treasure. There is only a word I gave up, and a freer word she gave me in its place of her own choosing, owing me nothing, and I would not trade the free I will, she said, standing sharp-tongued and dry-eyed and entirely ungoverned in that cold little church, for all the obedience of all the world. For a man may command a whole county to bow to him and stand as quite alone in the middle of it, or he may cross out a single word and be answered, once freely, by the one soul he could never make bow, and be, as I have been ever since, and past all his deserving, and thank God for it every ordinary morning of his life, not obeyed but loved.